Do you ever find it odd that we are living in a time in which two things, which would appear to be in direct opposition to one another, are both true? We've never had a larger percent of the adult American population as overweight or obese, some 70% by recent numbers. While at the same time, we've never had so many gyms, so many personal trainers, or so many fitness influencers. You have to admit it. It's a bit odd. And I'm not judging. In fact, as you may already know, I've been there personally. Okay, I was overweight. Technically, I was obese, nearly 50 pounds heavier than I am today. And the craziest part of all of it is I was going to the gym at the time. Okay, quite religiously, actually. I was working out. I was trying to eat clean. I was following much of what has been accepted as the, quote, way to get in shape, according to the modern fitness industry. But despite spending more time in the gym, the numbers on the scale kept climbing. And I don't think I'm alone there. What I was doing, what wasn't working for me, is not working for a massive number of people today. Without realizing it, I had fallen into a pattern of training, of eating, of recovering that had been built from the world of competitive bodybuilding. Now, if you'd shown me a picture at the time of the current Mr. Olympia, and you'd asked me if this is what I was going for, I would have said, well, of course not. What I was actually looking for was a build, a feeling, an athletic ability that shared very little with an elite bodybuilder. So why was I training like one? Competitive bodybuilding has so greatly influenced the world of health and fitness. So many of us have been following a set of training principles which have been developed for a very different set of goals than what many of us are going for, right? This blend of lean, ripped, and aesthetic physique, not to mention other things like mobility, athleticism, and endurance that have nothing to do with appearance over maximum hypertrophy. So with so many Americans falling short of their fitness goals and the incredible influence that bodybuilding has had over what we understand as, quote, fitness, is bodybuilding the right answer? Is going to the gym the right answer? And in my case, it turns out it wasn't. When I ditched the gym, when I ditched the bro splits for simple, short, brutally effective workouts at home, I saw my fitness, my physique, my energy all skyrocket. Coincidence? I'll let you decide. With that, I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Unconditional with Norbie Schickel. Today, we are expanding on our conversation on getting ripped, getting lean, and building an aesthetic physique. This is a topic we've touched on a bit in a few of our prior conversations, but we're going to continue to unpack this conversation because this is an area that many people would like to improve on and will likely have a very direct and meaningful impact on your health if done right. Okay, that's a huge caveat today. I really have to stress that in light of the rampant PED use, which has become the norm in some circles, but also your overall satisfaction and happiness with life. Is appearance the most important thing? As we discussed a few weeks ago in our episode on looks maxing, a topic which has only become bigger with a recent profile piece on the subject in the New York Times and interviews with people like Piers Morgan? No, at least that's my position. But anyone who says that it's not important, well, I personally just don't see any evidence for that. Hey, if you've been with me before, welcome back. It's very good to have you as always, as we attempt to reclaim the radical health and fitness that is our birthright. If you were new to the show, it's great to have you as well. And I'll just say this. If you are getting the sense that something is off with the health, the fitness, and the vitality of the world that we find ourselves in, one in which over 70% of the adult American population are either obese or overweight, one in which we find that nearly 2 in 3 of us are medicated for a chronic condition, with rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide, all rising dramatically in teenagers, okay, the group that has historically been the happiest, the most carefree, the most mentally sound. that despite access to the most advanced medical, diagnostic, surgical, and pharmaceutical capabilities the world has literally ever known, life expectancy has fallen for the first time in the most developed and wealthiest nation in the world. If this all strikes you as odd, that this might be common, but it sure as hell doesn't seem normal. If simply kicking back and waiting for the powers that be to come and get us out of this mess, if that just isn't your style, then you're in the right place. Do I have all the right answers? Of course not. But we're certainly going to do whatever we possibly can to understand what the hell went wrong, to turn this ship around one step at a time. And of course, we're going to have some fun along the way. So subscribe, like, share, just all that good stuff. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you like listening to podcasts, and we're going to keep this conversation going. So let's discuss the why for this episode. We've touched on the very macro state of modern health in much of the developed world. And I think that there is a very important question as to the health implications of aesthetics. Okay, I can promise a full episode on this question in the future. But for now, let's go beyond the macro question and let's drill into the why for this conversation on getting ripped, on getting lean, building an aesthetic physique. Now, for some people, the why is going to be self-evident. Okay, maybe analogous to explaining why making more money might be a good thing. But there's some nuance here, okay, some important context, and some reason to really reflect on this question before jumping into sets, reps, equipments, all that good stuff. And that has to do with the influence of bodybuilding. Okay, and I don't mean this in the generic sense of building up one's body. I mean this in the specific sense of the sport of competitive bodybuilding. Now, it will come as no surprise for those who have been with me before, but I'm not exactly what you would call a huge fan of PEDs, okay, performance-enhancing drugs. Now, other than that, and honestly, even with that, for adults, that are going in eyes wide open, really understand that this is taking a hit on their overall health, their overall longevity. They've looked at the trade-offs and they've said, you know what, even given these trade-offs, I still would use the performance-enhancing drugs. They're not hurting anybody else. Okay, fair enough. That's a different issue. But in general, I really don't have any opposition to the sport of bodybuilding. Okay, in many ways, I find it personally very impressive. Obviously tons of effort, tons of time, massive amounts of discipline compared to what most people are willing to muster in almost any other aspect of their life. A whole lot to admire here. But what I do have issue with, and this is different than the PED issue, is the manner in which the sport of bodybuilding, which is ultimately about hypertrophy, right, or muscle growth, and with a nod, let's be honest, to proportionality and getting to extremely low body fat percentages for an incredible, you could say even unbelievable moment in time on a stage, and even setting aside concerns regarding PEDs, long-term health implications of these dramatic bulk and cut cycles, water manipulation, etc. And just to be clear, these aren't trivial issues. Okay, a lot of bodybuilders have died young. I saw, I think, an article just last week about a competitive bodybuilder who died in the middle of a workout. But even if we set all that aside and just focus on the pure goal, right, sort of the pure logic of it, I think that for most people who are looking to, quote, get in shape, right, they've got this general idea of getting in shape, and maybe it's to have their clothes fit a little better, or, maybe they even want more, right? Maybe they want to be lean, muscular, maybe even ripped, let's say. Okay, no shame. But that what they're actually going for, as compared to the sport of competitive bodybuilding, is actually quite different. Hear me out for a second, okay? And I've said this before, but take the average person. Give them a choice, guy or girl, doesn't matter. But give them a choice between looking like the most recent Mr. Olympia, or a competitive bodybuilder, let's say, or an elite CrossFitter, an elite gymnast, MMA fighter, right? That sort of physique. Chances are they aren't going to pick looking like Mr. Olympia, right? Or a competitive bodybuilder, okay? The vascularity, the incredible water manipulation, the huge bulk. Most people aren't going to pick that. And of course, we can all say in our best Arnold impression, something to the effect of, don't worry, you never will look this way. And okay, fair enough, true. That is the go-to defense of bodybuilding in this case. But that doesn't really get to the issue here. Okay? Aesthetics are important, but it's more than an aesthetics thing. And when most people think about getting in shape, as we've discussed, and this is like 70% of the country, what they really mean, and this is just my sense, is that they're looking for some combination of a couple of things, right? They're looking for some combination of strength, of mobility, of endurance, of fat loss, and muscle gain, right? They're looking for an appearance for sure, but they're also looking for a feeling, right? A certain level of energy, right? And we can argue about, sort of where people fall in this sort of combination of things that they're looking for. But by and large, it's a slightly different goal than the more narrow goal, I would argue, of competitive bodybuilding. Is hypertrophy important? Sure. But is it the most important thing? I'm not so sure that it is. We can argue about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, but I'll offer 2 points in defense of this position. First, I would point to the fact that in most cases, as far as I can tell, losing weight, right, losing fat, will do much more to transform the average overweight person's appearance, how they feel, but also how they move and their confidence level than adding a comparable amount of muscle. Right? And there are many reasons for this, including the typical location, right? The typical distribution of body fat on the body, right? Maybe likely in the belly for men, maybe likely in the hips or, butt or that sort of thing for women. The density of fat versus muscle. Okay. Fair point. But for now, I'll just leave it at that. Okay. I think that if you were to take a comparable amount of fat loss versus muscle gain in the typical overweight person, they're going to see a much greater ROI with respect to fat loss than they will to muscle gain, just from an appearance and an overall sort of feeling perspective. Secondly, and I think we do have now some interesting real world evidence that many people will make this choice, okay, that they will actually make this choice. Given the choice between muscle gain and fat loss, most people will choose fat loss. And I think that the incredible rise in injectable weight loss drugs, GLP-1 agonists, in a way sort of proves this out. From what I understand, the data across a number of clinical trials suggests that the weight loss while on these drugs is both from fat, right? Fat loss and muscle loss. Now, what are the rough percentages? I think it's something like a 2/3, 1/3 split, right? So about 2/3 of the weight loss is coming in the form of fat loss. Typically, these are people that got fat to lose, right? We're not talking about 10 pounds for a wedding kind of a thing, but they've got some fat to lose. And it typically is a loss of both fat and muscle, right? And even though they are losing muscle as well, they are choosing the fat loss, right? They're not that concerned about ensuring that they preserve every single last bit of muscle tissue. Okay, so to me, I think this speaks to the point. And when you look at some of the dramatic transformations of people who have been on these GLP-1 agonists, these injectable weight loss drugs, I think it bears this out. Are there ways to limit the muscle loss? Well, sure, there are. Are there new and even potentially more incredible physique enhancing drugs that do the same, right? Trigger fat loss and muscle growth at the same time? Yeah, as crazy as it sounds, yes, there are. Okay, maybe combinations of drugs, and they're not that far away. Okay, definitely a topic for a future episode. But for now, I go back to my original point that despite the fact that what most people are going for is not to look, to feel, and perform like a bodybuilder, they eat, they train, and in some cases, supplement just like a bodybuilder would. Why is that? But it goes beyond that. We've never had more gyms. We've never had more personal trainers. We've never had more access to information on working out and protein and supplements and now PEDs, scarily in young people. And yet for so many people, it isn't working. And we should be more than a little curious as to why that is. Might the way we've all been conditioned to think about training, to think about working out, coming from the bodybuilding perspective, I think it's fair to say, actually be part of the issue? Now, maybe that's going too far. Maybe it isn't. And if the typical bro splits are working for you, if they are helping you to look the way that you want to look, to feel the way you want to feel, and perform across your life, my hat is off to you, obviously. You keep doing what you're doing. But if, like me in the past, you've tried the bro splits, you've tried the protein bars, and it just wasn't quite right for you, or let's be honest, and this is an issue for a lot of people, just making it to the gym is difficult, maybe because of cost, travel, or because of time, there is another way. Well, there are many, in fact, okay? But I'm going to share just three, okay? Three powerful ways to train, and which in my case enabled me to build the look, the feel, and the performance that I was going for, that are outside of the realm of what has passed for modern fitness, right? In a world that's been sort of dominated by bodybuilding. A way to get jacked outside of the gym, okay? What I like to refer to as bands, bells, and bodyweight training. So we're going to go through each of these, and there are many ways that these can be combined into a program. But I'll say right from the start that I do, and I've said this before, but I have a personal bias towards high-intensity interval training, what's sometimes referred to as HIIT training. And this, of course, is based on my own experience, but it's also based on the experience of many people who have successfully used HIIT training for this sort of, I don't want to say panacea, right? But it's for this combination of benefits that most of us are going for when it comes to getting in shape, right? It just really, really worked well for me. Now, why is this? Honestly, I don't know exactly, okay? But I'm not alone here, okay? I know that many people who have started their fitness journey by trying the bro splits, okay? While they do put on some muscle, they do build some strength, and that can be great. They tend to be disappointed by the fat loss component, okay? And now I know, right? For the bodybuilding apologists out there, they're going to be pointing to, yeah, that's when the calorie deficit comes in, right? That's where diet is. I get all that, okay? But for most people, this is a lot to ask, right? To embark on a new fitness training, a new fitness program. And oh, by the way, we got to start tracking macros. We got to start getting your diet dialed in. All that might be true. I tend to think about diet a bit differently, sort of than the typical calorie deficit conversation. But I think based on those two factors, I've just found that the high intensity interval training, eating real whole foods and walking, it's just a much easier way to build and maintain the physique that most of us are going for year round, right? Not to peak on a stage for a competition, but to look and feel pretty much the way you want year round. I've just found that for most people, myself including, HIIT training, high intensity interval training, actually delivers on what most people are truly looking for, right? Both muscle gain, right? Some muscle gain and fat loss, okay? Which is really what drives the difference in appearance, what drives the difference in feeling, endurance, just all that, okay? That's just my 2 cents. Now, I said I don't know why this is exactly, but I will give you my hunch, okay? And I think there's certainly a caloric burn component here, okay? I think that's undeniable. But I think the other aspect here is probably on impact to hormones, okay? And that those hormones improve through the use of certain compound movements, okay? And low rest intervals, okay? But I would also just say, maybe audit your own group of friends, your own group of peers. There are probably no more than a handful that have actually built and walk around with a lean, ripped physique with bro splits, okay? That's just my own sense on it. And my strong suspicion is that those who do, or those who did, I would be willing to bet a lot of money that getting their diet dialed in was really the difference. Okay. Once they really, really started tracking macros, operated at a caloric deficit, that's when they really started to see the difference. Okay. That's just my own sense. And my hunch is that there are many more in your friend group that have started CrossFit, that have done some high intensity interval training, that are able to maintain their body going forward for a longer period of time using high intensity interval training. Okay. It's just something to think about. Just my bias here. I could be totally wrong, but like I said, audit your own group of friends and maybe you'll see the same pattern that I do. Now we're going to talk about bells, bands, and body weight. Okay. And by I say bells, I mean kettlebells here. But each of these three training tools really lends itself well to high intensity interval training. You don't have to do it, right? You can obviously do it in a slightly different way, but it works really, really well if you want to. And of course, each of these categories can be strung together, quite easily. So without further ado, let's get into it. Bells, bands, and body weight. And we're going to go through each of these individually. First up, we have body weight training. Okay, this includes obvious things: calisthenics, push-ups, pull-ups, dips, leg lifts, burpees, body weight squats. Okay, all phenomenal movements that are going to provide some real aesthetic and athletic benefit. Okay, all classics for a reason. The obvious benefit of these movements is the fact that they are free. Okay, they require nothing, very little or no equipment in most cases. In some cases, you are quite literally built with whatever you need. And because of that, you get to operate with the force multiplier that is consistency. Okay. Consistency is the vicious or virtuous cycle, right? Is the force multiplier or the Achilles heel of any workout program. And because body weight movements require very little, almost no cost, they can be done in many places. They can be an incredible mechanism for staying consistent. And there's just really never any excuse. So this is hugely important. In a previous episode, we discussed the 4-minute Tabata workout. Okay, an unusual name if you're not familiar with Tabata workouts. But for those who are thinking, I don't have time to work out. I work a busy job. I've got a family, whatever the obligations are. I can't make it to the gym for whatever reason. I will say this: a 4-minute Tabata of something like pull-ups, dips, box jumps, and let's just say burpees, you're going to be totally smoked. Okay, most people, they're going to be smoked. Okay, just smoked with this one workout, and maybe a dip bar and a pull-up bar. But the excuse of time, I don't have time to work out, just completely gone, right? Banished forever and ever, amen, never to be spoken of again with this one simple workout. So if that is you, I would encourage you to go back and take a listen to that episode where I describe the Tabata workout, how it was developed, how it can be done. Can be very, very effective. Okay, I've used this workout for years, especially during times when I've been incredibly busy and I just really don't have time to spend even 20, 30 minutes working out. 4 or 5 minutes can do, incredible work for your body. So many options with calisthenics, many options with body weight, so many ways to string these movements together. Okay, but I will give you my favorite, highest ROI body weight movement that I believe, more so than any other single movement, has had the most profound impact on my physique. Okay, the one movement that if I could only do one movement for like the rest of my life or something, this would be it. And it requires no equipment, very little space, and it has progressive overload just built right in. Now, if this sounds too good to be true, and maybe it does, I assure you it's not. Okay, this is real. And it's what I like to call a modified burpee or a walkout burpee. Okay, I kind of use both interchangeably. Now, I know there are a lot of people who don't like burpees. I think there are even t-shirts, something to that effect, and I get it. Okay, there are many reasons for this, but I also know that one reason is because when you do a lot of burpees, it can put a lot of pressure on the wrists. But this version is way easier on the wrist, and it adds difficulty in all the right ways. Okay, at some point in time, I'll do a video tutorial on this, but for now, I'll just do my best to explain it the best way that I can. Okay, and also, just to be clear, I didn't come up with this. Okay, I learned it from my Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu instructor back in Charlotte, North Carolina, years ago. Okay, and he didn't have a name for it. He would just say, okay, do this movement right here, and then he would demonstrate it, so we kind of all knew it. So I can't take credit for it, and I can't really give proper credit either, okay, because I don't know what it's called. But that is life sometimes, so here it goes. Okay, so step 1, you're going to start with your feet shoulder width apart, just a normal stand, okay, standing shoulder width apart. hands and arms at your side. Step 2, you're going to drop down into this hip hinge sort of squat position with your palms flat on the ground, in front of your feet, kind of by the side of your feet, just kind of like a standard burpee, okay? But here's the difference. In a normal burpee, here's where you'd shoot your feet back. But in this variation, you're not going to do that, okay? Instead, you're going to walk your hands out. So think something like 1, 2, 3, sort of baby hand walk steps to get you to that low plank position, that low push-up position. I should say the high push-up position, but in this plank position. Now, step 3, instead of jumping your feet forward, which is what you would normally do in a burpee, you're going to drop down to a push-up, okay? And then instead of coming straight up, you're going to shoot your butt and hips back, right? Sort of recruiting the muscles of your shoulders, upper chest, triceps, and core to bring you back into a position that's like a downward facing dog from yoga, but with bent knees. Okay, from here, you're in this kind of crouched position, hips back, shooting back. But from here, you're going to jump forward, hop forward, feet to the front of the mat if you're thinking of yoga. Feet are going to be kind of behind your hands to the side of your hands, right? And then from there, you're just going to sort of baby hop up. You can do a clap over your head. You can do sort of a jump and then land back in the standing position. So that would be 1. Okay, that would be 1 repetition. Now, if I think about my position relative to something like a yoga mat, my feet at the start of the rep are at the bottom of the mat. But at the end of the rep, my feet are towards the top. So if I immediately go forward to the next rep, I would just continue to move forward, right? I'd be advancing my position. If I'm outside in a field or at the beach, that might be one thing. I can just sort of keep going, sort of doing walkout burpees in perpetuity. But what I like to do if I'm inside or if I'm in an enclosed space is I just like to take 1 or 2 pivot steps between the rep, right? And just make a 180-degree turn so that I alternate the direction between reps. So hopefully that makes sense, right? At the first rep, I'm at the bottom of the mat. I do my burpee. I end up at the top of the mat. I do a 180, and then I work back going from the top of the mat, then to the bottom of the mat, right? And then I just keep working that way. Now, why do I like this variation? Well, first and foremost, it's way easier on the wrists. Okay, by walking your hands out, you slow the movement down and resist the temptation to just slam those hands down into a push-up position when you're doing a lot of burpees. Okay, it's very common. So if you're getting up to where you're doing a lot of burpees, sets of 20, you can even, you could go doing burpees for minutes, right, on end. I would personally consider making this switch. This is one of the reasons. It's way easier on your wrist. Okay, but there's something else that I really, really like about this variation. Okay, you'll notice that this variation has a push-up. I've said previously that I don't like just the straight burpee with a push-up. And the reason for that is when you add a push-up with a standard burpee, you just sort of hip hinge, your back, you shoot your legs back and you do a push-up and then you're back and that's 1. That significantly increases the workload on the chest and triceps, but not in the legs, core, hips, or back. Okay, but in this variety, yes, the push-up increases the workload for the chest and triceps, but it also increases the workload for the hips, core, legs, and back. Okay, so it brings much more involvement of these muscles, including much more involvement in recruitment of the shoulders. So in short, yes, it does make this movement more difficult, but it does so, in my opinion, in a very balanced way. Okay, you will fail at much fewer reps with this variation than a standard burpee, maybe half as many reps or fewer. But from my perspective and my way of thinking, it does this in a much, much more balanced way. Okay, makes the movement much more difficult, does it in a balanced way. Now, how do I like to use this particular variation, my favorite variation? Well, one way I like to do is to just do an entire workout of burpees. Okay, now that may sound super depressing for some people. I get that. But with this variation, I really, really like it. Okay, and I've described this previously, but I just ladder up and then I ladder down. And so I do 1 rep, take a breath, right? And then I change directions and then I just do 2, take 2 breaths, change directions, right? Do 3, take 3 breaths, right? You get the idea. So I'm kind of working an even work to rest ratio. That's what the breaths help me do. So I really, really like this variation because guess what? It's got progressive overload built right in. Super simple. Anybody can understand it. Maybe the first time you do it, you get to 5. Maybe the week later, you start working on getting up to, 6 and then back down, and 7 and back down, right? You get the idea. And one thing that's interesting and cool about this is that every additional number that you add, right? So going from a burpee ladder of 11, say, to a burpee ladder of 12, every time you do that, it gets a little bit harder because you're adding, if you go up and down, you're adding, in this case, you'd be adding, say, going from, say, a burpee ladder of 3 to a burpee ladder of 4, you've added 8 reps. But going from a burpee ladder of, say, 11 to a burpee ladder of 12, you've added 24 reps, right? So it's 3 times the number of reps. So it gets harder as you get, higher and higher and doing, greater numbers. I've used this workout a whole bunch, done it for years, huge believer. The other way that I like to use walkout burpees or modified burpees is I use them as a warm-up. Okay. And the way I do it is, again, super simple. I love to just keep it very simple, brutal, effective. Okay. Pavel has a really good book called Simple and Sinister. We'll talk about Pavel Tsatsouline when we talk about kettlebells, but sort of borrowing from that idea, right? The simpler things are, the easier it is to get into them, and the more effective they are. Again, it enables that superpower that is consistency. And more so than anything, that is what is going to give you the bulk of the gains, right? Almost no matter what workout program you pick. If you're not consistent, it's not going to work. Greater consistency, greater results, okay? So this one, keeping it simple, really, really helps with that. So I pick my favorite song as a warm-up or a song I'm really liking at that moment. It might be 2, 3, maybe 3.5, 4 minutes, that sort of thing. And I just do one round of walkout burpees for the entire song. And at first, this is likely going to be very difficult. You might have to take some breaks, but after a while, you'll just be able to bang them out. And then you get to proceed with whatever your workout is for that day. And even still, I keep the workouts pretty short. I mean, most days I probably work out 15 minutes, maybe less. If I'm doing my Tabatas, certainly less. But I'll do a round of walkout burpees, and then I'll proceed with whatever my workout is for that day. So again, really, really effective way to just add these in, an incredible movement. Give it a shot. I think you'll get some really, really good results. So even if you don't have access to a gym, you have your own body and access to a space about the size of a yoga mat, then just no excuses, right? No gym needed, very low risk of getting injured, an unbelievably simple path to progressive overload. So just add another number, and these burpees are your ticket. Now, these walkout burpees are one of my favorites, of course, but there is so much to work with here, right? Beyond the basic movements of push-ups, pull-ups, dips, body weight squats, lunges, step-ups, jump rope, right? You get it. The list goes on and on. But when those more basic movements start to get overly easy or that just get boring, well, there are many advanced derivatives that you can add into the mix. Things like Bulgarian split squats, just too many push-up variations to list, but, you can go in and find, people that will have, 30, 60, push-up variations on YouTube, right? There's so many that you can do. Same thing with pull-ups. And I will say that, one of the biggest critiques of calisthenics work and body weight movements is that it can be difficult to train legs. And I definitely get that critique, and there is some truth to that. But again, with some of these more advanced, complicated movements that you're really building towards, just a level of balance and recruitment of these very small stabilizer muscles, I mean, you can do a whole lot. Things like Nordic curls for the posterior chain, right? Think back, glutes, hammies. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but reverse Nordics, right? So starting from a kneeling position and with a straight, sort of position from your knees all the way up to your head, you sort of lever back, right? You using a whole lot of your quadricep muscles. It can provide a lot of pressure on your knees. So obviously tread very, very lightly, especially if you had knee problems. But a phenomenal amount of work for, say, like the quads. And then this incredible stretch on the psoas muscle, right? The muscle that is the muscle that tends to get really tight because we sit, right? That psoas muscle gets stretched, just like the couch stretch gets stretched incredibly well with a reverse Nordic. Okay. Phenomenal movement. And you can start assisted, with bands, as we'll talk about in just a bit. We've got single leg pistol squats, right? So maybe body weight squats start to become very easy. Get it for sure. But single leg pistol squats, incredibly difficult for most people. One other very quick point I want to make on body weight, which is we have all been guilty of what some people refer to as ego lifting at times, certainly myself included. And that is sacrificing the quality of the movement so that we can bang out more reps or just do more weight. And this is extra tempting when it comes to body weight movements. Okay. But it is especially important in this case that you don't do that. Okay. In order to get the maximum benefit. Doing 100 sloppy head bob push-ups will not be nearly as beneficial as 10 to 15 controlled, full range of motion quality reps. Okay. That is the ticket. You can get in your head, oh, I'm doing tons and tons of work. But if it's not effective work, it's just a waste of time. Okay, so that's some commentary on body weight. Let's continue with the next tool in our arsenal, and that is bands. Okay, workout bands, sometimes referred to as resistance bands. I've heard them called WOD bands or pull-up assist bands. These are heavy duty, think you can kind of wrap your whole body to do push-ups. You can do squats. You can do a lot with these bands. Okay, they're very heavy duty. And if you're looking to purchase them online, say on Amazon, or I think they even sell them on Rogue Fitness, take one of those terms, plug them in, and that should be able to pull up a set that will get you started. And for something around $30 for a set of these bands at the low end, given how versatile, portable, and effective bands can be, in my humble opinion, they are a complete no-brainer. Okay, everybody should have a set. Now, why am I such a fan of bands? Well, for a few reasons. First, because they can add resistance and progressive overload to many body weight movements in the absence of weights without adding more time to your workout, right? So let's take push-ups, right? Maybe you get very proficient at push-ups, as some people do, right? There are people that might bang out hundreds or even thousands of push-ups before they reach anything close to failure. Maybe not all in one set, but you get the point. There's a very famous football player named Herschel Walker, and apparently he did something like 1,000 push-ups per day. Right? Now, for most people, 1,000 push-ups, you're going to split this up into multiple sets. This is going to take some time. You throw on a heavy resistance band, and you get something similar to adding weight to a movement. Now, I know it's not technically the same, but it's all good, still effective, without the need for expensive weights or going to the gym or adding more time to your workout. And because they come in a variety of sizes, you can scale up or scale down the resistance fairly easily. Second, bands provide a really good way of filling gaps with what you could do with body weight exercises alone. Okay, body weight, certainly a lot of variety. We've talked about some of it. But let's say you want to do something like isometric curls. Difficult to do with body weight alone. Yeah, no, I get it. You've got pull-ups, you've got chin-ups, that you can work the biceps. But if working the biceps in a different way is your thing, and nothing wrong with that, right? Curls for the girls, all that, then bands can be a really good way to target this movement. Glute bridges, another fantastic movement, and a movement that's very important, especially as we talk about kettlebells in a bit. But having a heavy resistance band really improves your ability to perform this movement in the absence of weights. And while glute bridges are great for growing your glutes, they are also an incredibly important exercise for your legs, for your back, and hips. Okay, I really, really like this movement a lot. Bands are also great for stabilizer muscles, rehab, and prehab type work. Working on, say, your shoulders in odd angles, hip flexors, adductors, and abductors. Okay, I don't need to belabor the point. You get the idea. But there's really a lot that you can do. Lastly, I like the fact that they are lightweight and they are portable. Okay, when I worked as a management consultant in a past life, I spent many nights traveling to clients, working out of hotel gyms. And you never know what they're going to have there, right? Usually some dumbbells, maybe a cable machine, that sort of thing, but just not the greatest. And who knows if what they have is going to match your program for the day, right? Much, much more difficult with bro splits. Pack a set of bands and you're good to go, right? Just bring the gym with you and never miss a day. Again, consistency, that is the superpower, right? So bands, body weight, with maybe $30 in spend, maybe 20 minutes a couple times a week. Or if you're convinced to try that 4-minute Tabata workout, okay, definitely go check that out. I mean, if you're starting, if you're early in this, it's going to be incredibly brutal and very effective, okay? Or if you're just looking to get back after some time off. So to me, it's just a no-brainer, okay? You can go really, really far. Now, you might be wondering, okay, well, just how far? How much muscle? How ripped can I get without weights, without going to the gym? And again, I think quite far, actually, for what most people are going for. Check out guys like Chris Heria, Frank Madrano. There's a guy, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, Ian Barsegal, right? Or if you want to go old school, right? Bar stars, street workouts, guys like Hannibal for King, right? Incredibly impressive aesthetics, but also incredibly impressive athletics. Okay, I'll add some links to these guys in the show notes if you want to just get a sense for what I'm talking about. But I think for most people, they would be quite pleased with what they could accomplish outside of the traditional gym setting and outside of the traditional bodybuilding program. Are we talking juiced up bodybuilder levels of muscle mass? No, right? It's a different thing. But again, if that's not what you're going for either, then why train the way that they do? These guys are built more like Greek statues, right? Gymnasts, think wrestlers, fighters. And for a few reasons, but I think the main reason is because form is following function here, right? Lean, chiseled, powerful, okay? High endurance. I think you get the point. And if this is what you're going for, just give it a shot, right? Might work better for you. It certainly did in my case. Last but not least, we've got to talk about bells. And of course, I am talking about kettlebells. Or as my daughter would say when she was like 4, Kettlebellos, which is just like the cutest freaking thing ever. Okay, but kettlebells, bells, or Kettlebellos, whatever you like, let's talk about this strange piece of Russian iron that seems to divide the world of fitness in two. Now, if you're unfamiliar with kettlebells, the way I would describe them is that they look a lot like a large cannonball with an iron U-shaped handle at the top. And they look that way because that's what they are. Or at least that's how they started. Now, I don't know that the complete history is known on this, but from what I understand, they originated in Russia something like in the 1700s, okay? And they did come from quite literally taking a U-shaped handle and attaching it to a cannonball, and then starting to perform, sort of ballistic movements with them. So they've been used in Russia to build lean, powerful, and aesthetic physiques for hundreds of years. And that's pretty much where they stayed until a guy named Pavel Tsatsouline, he's a former Soviet Special Forces guy, came to America and demonstrated how simple, brutal, and effective kettlebell training could be for this blend of strength, power, and endurance and aesthetics. Okay, I don't think it's a stretch to say that Pavel is the GOAT here when it comes to kettlebell training in the United States. He's written a number of books on strength training, kettlebell training, and flexibility. He's been on Joe Rogan's show, Huberman's show, Tim Ferriss. He's a very fascinating guy. He's one of these guys that combines very practical knowledge and experience with science and even with a historical perspective. Okay, just super impressive. And I think the first book I ever read on kettlebells came from Pavel. I think it was maybe Enter the Dragon or Enter the Kettlebell. I forget. But if you do get into kettlebell training, he's definitely a name that you're going to want to get familiar with. Now, I should point out, especially if you start going on YouTube or Instagram or TikTok or something and looking up tutorials, there are actually two different forms of kettlebell style training in Russia. There's something which is called kettlebell sport, and that's a translation of whatever the Russian word is, which from what I understand involves longer duration, typically lower weight kettlebells, and all the bells are the same size. I think nowadays they're typically steel kettlebells. But because of the nature of the sport, the form on each movement is a little different. Okay. And as endurance is a key factor here, each rep is done at something below maximum effort. Okay. There's differences in breathing, there's differences in muscle contraction, and a bit more. Now compare that to what's referred to as hard style kettlebell training, which, as the name implies, involves often heavier weights performed at much lower rep ranges with maximum effort in each rep. In addition, breathing and muscle contraction tends to be much more, aggressive would be the way to describe it succinctly. To be completely honest and transparent, I've always been into hard style, okay? So I'm certainly not a guru on kettlebell sport, and I hope that I'm not speaking out of turn. But just know that if you see the same movement performed in two different ways and you're confused, that might be the reason, okay? That there are two different ways of training some of the movements. So what are some of these movements that can be performed with kettlebells? Well, it's a very long list, but the prime movements, I would say, the ones that you should likely start with, the ones that I perform most of the time, still, to be honest, would be things like goblet squats, windmills, deadlifts, swings, cleans, maybe something like clean and jerk or clean and press, thrusters, and Turkish get-ups. Now, there are many variations within these basic movements, and I'm sure there are those out there that would have a different starting list of what the prime or basic movements would be, but these are certainly some of the big ones. And most of these, with a few exceptions, can be performed with a single kettlebell or with two kettlebells. And I'll link to some videos which walk through some of these movements, but a couple of names that you can trust would be people like Pavel Tsatsouline, obviously, a name I've spoken about, and Dan John. Okay, two names that you can take away from. And I think it's fair to say that you can trust that if they're giving you a perspective on form, follow it. Okay, but there are a lot of others. There's YouTube, there's Instagram, TikTok for sure. And yes, with kettlebells, it's a slightly steeper learning curve than with something like, say, bodyweight movements, but the benefits can be incredible. So well worth the investment of time and cost, in my opinion. Which leads us to getting a kettlebell, right? Making that investment. What weight should you start with? Well, Pavel makes a point of saying that the standard weights for kettlebell training in Russia are 53 pounds, or 24 kilograms for a man, 35 pounds, or 16 kilograms for a woman. And likely for this reason, these are probably the two most common kettlebell sizes that you can find. And because I'm hard style, I like to use iron kettlebells. Okay. The best iron kettlebells are cast in a single pour, meaning that the handle and the base of the bell are a single piece, as opposed to a separate handle welded onto the bell. Okay. But honestly, I don't know that that's much of an issue anymore. Even some of the cheapest kettlebells that I've seen on, say, Amazon are cast from a single piece. So that's very good news. As for brands go, there are many. My personal bias is for Ader. That's ADER. I do have some Rogue kettlebells as well, and they're pretty decent as well. Good size handle, smooth but not super slippery, wide base. Both of them feel pretty balanced. Both of them feel pretty good. The only reason I give Ader a slight edge is I like the Ader finish a little bit better. It's a little bit smoother. And I've had my first Ader kettlebell for something like 15 years at this point, and it's still the primary kettlebell that I use. So as far as sizes go, if you were first getting into kettlebell training and you're a man, I'd actually recommend not starting with a 53-pound kettlebell. And I'll tell you why. Okay, get a 35-pound. First, you will minimize your chances of injury as you learn with the lighter kettlebell. So that's very important. Second, even when you bump up to a 53 pound, or maybe even something bigger in the future for something like a swing or a goblet squat, you will still get use out of the lighter kettlebell in movements like the clean and jerk or clean and press, things like thrusters or Turkish get-ups. In my opinion, if you get into kettlebell training, you will ultimately want both. So start with a lighter weight. Now, if you're a woman, same logic applies. I'd start with something like an 8 kilogram or an 18-pound kettlebell, and then the same idea, right? I'd plan to get a 35-pound as you progress and as your form develops. Now, cost-wise, these are going to be more expensive than bands, so if it's an either or, I would choose bands to start. But for reference, a 35-pound kettlebell on Ader's site, and Ader's probably one of, if not the most expensive brands out there, so you certainly can go cheaper. But a 35-pound kettlebell on Ader's site is $87. Okay. A 53-pound, $120, 18 pounds, $47. Okay. So even with a slightly higher price point than bands, still not bad for most people. Okay. Certainly not in my perspective. Now, when you consider the longevity and the effectiveness of the kettlebells for many years, and I can attest to this personally, very, very high ROI. I would say for probably about 10 years, the sum totality of my personal gym was a single set of bands, a 35-pound kettlebell, a 53-pound kettlebell, and an ab wheel. Okay, I am a little partial to the ab wheel. And this was an incredible way to stay in phenomenal shape year-round with a one-time investment of around $200, $250. Just hard to beat that. Now, of course, one of the main points of this episode is to point out the incredible tools at your disposal, which are free or very low cost to help you get into the best shape of your life, to build your dream physique, to look and feel and perform your best, okay, at any age. I've passed along some names and I'll link to some tutorials, but you might be wondering, is there any way that I could get feedback on my form as I attempt to master something like the kettlebell swing or the clean to press or anything other than hiring a personal trainer? And yes, okay, there is. It's incredible and it is free. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Reddit has a very active kettlebell community. Okay, all you would need to do is shoot a short video of yourself performing a movement. And even people like Dan John, a name I've spoken about, who is active in the Reddit kettlebell community, might weigh in on your form. Okay, and it's all for free. To me, this is just an incredible resource. When I first started in kettlebell training, I didn't see anything like that. Okay, so to me, this is just one of these other reasons why this is just an incredible time to be alive and an incredible opportunity to experiment with things outside of the bodybuilding paradigm. Now, there is an incredibly important, I cannot stress this enough, bit of hard-earned wisdom that I have to pass along. And you need to take it if you start to train with kettlebells, okay? I never offer, hey, this is a must-do. This is the closest thing to a must-do, okay? Just my humble opinion here. Now, for many people, even when they are performing, say, a kettlebell swing correctly, they may start to develop over time some pain on the outside of the hip or the front side of the hip, right? Hip flexor area. This did happen for me. I've heard it happening for other people, including, I believe, Tim Ferriss, okay? They'll get this pain and it's somewhat inexplicable. They're wondering, is my form off? Do I need to turn my legs out more? Should I turn my legs in more, right? It can be a little bit confusing. Not debilitating pain, but disconcerting pain. And as far as I can tell, this comes from an imbalance of workload, assuming you have the form correct. And there is a very simple way to avoid that and head that off at the pass, okay? To stop this from becoming an issue before it ever rears its ugly head. And that is with a complementary and, in my view, necessary exercise that almost nobody talks about. Occasionally somebody will. I think it's even in one of Pavel's books. But there's a very simple exercise that should be paired, in my opinion, with kettlebell swings. And that is glute bridges, okay? And the simple way that I think about it is for each kettlebell swing set that you do, so for each set of kettlebell swings that you do, I should say, pair it with a set of glute bridges. Okay, very, very simple, very effective, very easy to remember, and you will head off the potential for hip pain, the outside of your hip, front side of your hip at the pass. If you, for some reason, or somebody you know, develop some hip pain, front side, side of your hip, glute bridges. In my humble opinion, that is the solution. Now, what are some favorite movements with kettlebells? Obviously, the swing, right? Two-handed kettlebell swing. Just a great exercise for explosive power, for the hips, for the back, for glutes, hamstrings, the entire posterior chain, right? Those sort of three muscle systems. And also for endurance training, right? You start getting up into these sets of 20, 30 with the appropriate size kettlebell, and you will quickly find out how great kettlebells are for building endurance. Okay, other movements I like, I like deadlifts with kettlebells. In my case, I have really long arms, so I like sumo style deficit deadlifts. Okay, it just keeps me honest, better movement for me. Again, great for opening the hips, working out the legs, the backs, the back, the glutes. Turkish get-ups, of course. And if you were doing Turkish get-ups, I emphasize slow and controlled. Okay, this would not be part or a good exercise to include in your HIIT training, as an example, but as a standalone exercise, phenomenal. Great for the shoulder, great for the back, great for all these little stabilizer muscles. I do like the clean and press, but these days, what I've really been liking is a double kettlebell thruster. Okay, really, really, for whatever reason, I've just been loving that exercise. So I do a day of thrusters at least once per week. And then there's another movement that I like a lot with kettlebells. Again, just an example of you can take something on kind of the body weight side, and then you can, build in additional load with either band or with kettlebells. And that is what I've seen referred to as the ATG split squat. So if you've ever followed Knees Over Toes Guy, and we'll talk about his work in the future, just incredible. Definitely should be something that you're familiar with if you aren't. He has this, if you ever see him on like his book cover or something like that, he's in this like low squat position with his knee way over his toe. That is what he refers to as the ATG split squat. And I like to do this with kettlebells. So I'll put a kettlebell in each hand, and I've got two different variations of this particular movement that I really like with kettlebells. Now, why these movements? Well, one, as I mentioned before, these are examples of the kinds of compound lend themselves well to high intensity interval training. That is my bias. Okay. So I've been clear about that. I'll continue to be clear about that for obvious reasons, right? One, I think they are incredibly effective metabolically, but I also, and this is just my hunch here, is that they are very helpful for your hormones. And I've seen other people talk about this. I've seen other people comment on this. So it's not just me, but I do think that this is part of the secret, if you will, of high intensity interval training. But the other reason that I really like these movements is they do an incredible job of building and strengthening the four areas of the body that tend to fail as we age, right? Or that tend to become a weak point as we age. And that would be the knees, the shoulders, the hips, and the back. Okay. You look at most people that have problems as they age, it's one of these four systems. Okay. One of these areas breaks down, or multiple areas break down, but it's going to typically be in these areas. Most people at 70 aren't complaining about bicep pain. They're not complaining about forearm pain. They're not complaining about, their quads not being big enough, right? It's one of these four systems. This is where they go. Okay. I like to refer to them as the four horsemen of the aging apocalypse. I'm not sure if I came up with that. Somebody else may have, but that's the way I think about them. And these movements specifically, and kettlebells in general, are an incredibly powerful weapon to have in your arsenal for maximum health span and longevity. And again, from an ROI perspective, they're just really hard to beat. Now, I know I've said this before, but it just bears repeating. Are kettlebells the most effective tool for building, say, like bodybuilding levels of hypertrophy? No, okay, they aren't. But again, if that's not your goal, and I know that that is the case for many people, they may help to meet your actual goals much more effectively than bro splits. That definitely was the case in my case, and that's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about sharing this. Okay, one of the things that I see very often is that people embark on a workout routine. They find something online, they see this yoked up guy in the gym, or they see this yoked up guy on YouTube. They don't know what it took for that guy to build that physique. Chances are it took some PEDs, took many years. It takes incredible discipline over the diet, and he's peaking for a show. But they take a look at that and they say, well, maybe that's right for me. And what tends to happen is they actually get a little bit bigger, put on a little bit of muscle. They don't lose very much weight. They don't lose very much fat, and they wind up a little bit disappointed. Okay. In my opinion, as I've said, this is just a different way of approaching. And if the bro splits and the bodybuilding paradigm hasn't worked for you, give something like this a shot. I don't have anything to sell anyways. So, I'm just giving you what has worked for me. That really is the point of this episode, okay, is to make the case that it is possible to build and maintain a lean, powerful, aesthetic physique without bro splits and without the gym, right? To get ripped, maybe even somewhat jacked, the way that men and some women of old did it, okay, without the PEDs, without creatine, without gyms, with bands, bells, and body weight movements. And of course, and these things enable all of that, the superpower of consistency. Okay, that is obviously going to be a critical difference maker. And that is one of the main reasons why I have a strong bias towards this way of training. Now, that's going to have to be it for me today. Thank you for the listen as always. Check out some of the resources that I mentioned. I will definitely make sure to link them in the show notes. And if you are enjoying the show, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the show. It's 100% completely free. You'll never miss another episode, and it will help me turn this show into what I know that it can become. Thank you so much in advance, and I will see you again next week.